Okay, so everyone's been talking about the old Barbie movies a lot lately, and I think we're all in agreement that they're great. We all love the memes, the discourse, rating them best to worst, but there's something that no one's really talking about that I feel like we need to talk about, and everybody knows it's there, but no one wants to talk about it. But we can't go on like this and not address the elephant in the room. Why does she look like that? Why is she blue? This nightmare animal has been haunting us since 2007. But no more will this beast be a mark upon the Barbie franchise. We need to settle this. First of all, where did this come from? The Oscar-winning film Barbie as the Island Princess opens on a scene of Azul the peacock and Saji the red panda finding Ro, played by Barbara Millicent Roberts, washed up on the shore of their idyllic island home. Saji wants to raise her and Azul just wants to take her jewels and leave her to die like a psychopath, but eventually they decide to raise her and we cut to 10 years later, which is when Tika just shows up out of nowhere. Now, we know this is an island because of context clues, and we know that Ro got here when she went overboard in a storm, but we're given no clues as to where Tika came from. It's true, she could have been washed up in a storm as well, but given her and Ro's sisterly dynamic, you would think that would have been mentioned to help develop their characters. Now, when you think of an elephant's habitat, you're probably going to think of wide open savanna or sprawling rainforest, and not so much sandy beaches. But it's not entirely unrealistic to assume that an elephant would be born on an island, and it also might help explain some of her appearance. When a species becomes isolated on an island habitat, it often undergoes changes to adapt to its new environment. 11,500 years ago, elephant populations became isolated on islands in the Mediterranean, and as these chunky megafauna struggled to survive on limited island resources, smaller members of the population had an easier time getting enough food, so they got to pass on their genes more. And over time, the elephants on these islands got smaller and smaller to cope with their habitat. This process often results in new species evolving, so in the case of the Mediterranean elephants, this gave rise to multiple species of itty-bitty dwarf elephants. Their babies were this big. They also had neotenic features, meaning they retained juvenile traits into adulthood. So it could be possible that Tika's family belongs to a species of dwarf elephant, and she's actually an adult that looks like a weird monster baby. Is that worse? I don't know if that's worse. Admittedly, these dwarf elephants did have a higher brain to body mass ratio than their mainland counterparts, which could have indicated heightened intelligence. Now, we do get the impression that Tika's not a full-grown elephant, both from her immaturity and constant condescension from other characters. If that's the case, she is a little big for an elephant that's undergone island dwarfism. Today, all the small elephants of the Mediterranean are extinct, but there are still some isolated populations of elephant that have adapted to closed forested island habitats, much like the island of this film, by becoming slightly smaller than your average-sized elephant. These pygmy elephants don't have to cope with the same resource scarcity that dwarf elephants did, so they get to be a bit taller. We know from the abundant vegetation and fruit that resources on this island aren't scarce at all, so it makes sense that a population could survive on this island without needing to be as small as elephants living on an arid Mediterranean landmass. Okay, so Tika was born here, the same presumably as Saji and Azul, but if that's the case, why is she alone? It makes sense for the other animals to be on their own because they're both adults. Red pandas are solitary and peacocks kind of just do whatever they want. But Tika is repeatedly shown to be very young and immature, even dependent on the others. Where are her parents? Why don't we see a herd of elephants on this island? What happened here? To answer that, we need to look at another real island, a wind-blasted barren rock in the Arctic Ocean. This is Wrangel Island, and while it doesn't look like much, it was the last stronghold of the woolly mammoth. Mammoths survived on Wrangel Island long after their counterparts in Eurasia and America had disappeared, until about 2,000 years ago when they suddenly and quickly died out. It's theorised that the small population could have been wiped out by natural disaster or a series of extreme weather events. Small, isolated populations like those on islands are particularly vulnerable to this, as there's less likelihood of survivors in a small population. But there's something else that rendered these mammoths vulnerable, something more terrifying, more inevitable than even the weather itself. Something reduced this population to a shadow of its former glory, and to understand it, we need to understand genetic drift. So, the genes we have code for different traits. Let's say an animal has gene E to code for eye colour. Now, different variations of this gene might code for different eye colours. Let's say capital E is green and lowercase e is blue. These different types of the same gene are called alleles, and populations will have different frequencies of each allele. So let's say we have a population where green eyes are more abundant than blue eyes, but this can change from generation to generation because of genetic drift. Let's say green eyes are a dominant trait, and these guys all reproduce, and the next generation has an even bigger proportion of green eyes versus blue eyes. And let's say in the next generation it just so happens that all the offspring born have green eyes. These frequencies might also be changed by things like predation or migration of individuals into or out of a population. So what does this have to do with Mattel's monster? Well, smaller populations are more vulnerable to the effects of genetic drift, so as the generations progress, the diversity of alleles and the diversity of traits decreases. A small population, like one on an island, can't have new alleles added from an outside population, but less frequent or less fit alleles might disappear, or new ones might be added when a mutation occurs. Usually when harmful mutations pop up, they'll end up disappearing from the population as those that carry the mutations struggle to survive and reproduce more than their counterparts. However, when a population is small, these mutations have a greater chance of spreading throughout the population before they can die out. And as these mutated organisms reproduce, more genetic errors occur, and suddenly all these detrimental genes are accumulating in a population. This is what happened to the tiny mammoth population of Wrangel Island, where genetic analysis found that as their population remained isolated, more and more mutations accumulated, and by the end of their time on Earth, it's believed that they had lost their sense of smell, which would have interfered with foraging and social dynamics, and, in a spooky twist, their fur may have become comprised of hollow hairs, giving their coats a ghostly, translucent appearance. Maybe this is what happened to her parents. Maybe Tika is the final, blue-skinned, blue-eyed survivor of a population that suffered so much inbreeding they lacked any genetic diversity to survive changes in their environment. So we've talked about all that. We need to talk about the ridiculously huge lashes. Now, sure, there could be biological arguments for these. Camels have long lashes to keep out dust and sand. Maybe Tika's species evolved these to deal with sand being kicked up in storms. Maybe the perfect white sand of her island prison creates a lot of glare, so long lashes evolved to combat that. But I don't think so. No, I think it's something else. We know from the events of the movie that Tika is a manipulative creature capable of strategic thinking to the point of deceiving her best friend into thinking that Prince Antonio doesn't like her, inciting her to return to their island. At this point, it's worth noting that this kind of cunning and ability to plan ahead is something that's more commonly seen in predators. It's also worth noting that predators need to have good depth perception. So while herbivores will have eyes that face out to the sides to scan for danger, a predator will have eyes that face forward. So what does all this have to do with Tika's eyelashes? Usually, an elephant will have a bit of hair on its body, but Tika is completely bald. Could this be a result of the genomic meltdown we were talking about before? If so, how did Tika retain her eyelashes? Why are they so big? So maybe they're not the result of genetics at all. Maybe Tika, who was raised with Azul, would also have a proclivity for vanity. That's right, I think these lashes are false. But that doesn't make sense in the context of this world. Assuming it takes place sometime in the 18th or 19th century, synthetic eyelashes wouldn't be invented for at least another 100 years in 1911. The only fibres that Tika would have access to at this time to mimic eyelashes would be mink fur. Tika, who despite her scheming nature manages to convince her friends again and again of her innocence. Tika, whose eyes face forward, like a predator. Maybe this is the crux of her character, the last of her species, mutated beyond survivability, driven mad by the perfection of the creatures around her. Maybe this is the real reason she went with Ro to the kingdom of Apollonia, to feed into her own unhinged vanity and seek more resources, in the form of the pelts of her fellow animals to maintain her horrific visage. The Barbie brand has come under fire in the past for promoting unrealistic beauty standards, and maybe this is their response. Maybe what we thought was a surface level love story about someone finding out who they are is actually a story of the trappings of perfectionism, of the danger of vanity. Or it was 2007 and they had a low animation budget, but probably the other thing.